Our first presenter is Dan Noonan. His presentation title is Preserving Born Digital Content in the Gray Digital Preservation Repository for Ohio State University. So Dan, would you please go ahead?
Thank you. And I'll get to share my screen here. Okay, great. And welcome everybody. Good afternoon for my East Coast partners, and good morning or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. Yes, I'm Dan Noonan, Digital Preservation Librarian at The Ohio State University. Been with them for over 18 years now. It's kind of hard to believe it's been that long. And today I want to talk to you about our Gray Digital Preservation Repository. And let me just need to move one other thing out of the way here. There we go. Nope, that's not right. Sorry, just got to get the boxes screen out of the way of my notes here. That'll do it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. And so we talked about our Gray Digital Preservation Repository, how it got its start and where we're going with it, and the workflow changes that we've had to institute along the way, and be more focused on that workflow aspect of the repository. So several years back, we were having a problem trying to figure out what to do with our born digital collections at scale, things that come from, say, our university archives, electronic records, digital records of the university that we have to collect as part of the records management program, the archival program, and documenting the history of the university. At that point in time, we had a well-established institutional repository based on a DSpace platform called the Knowledge Bank, but that's really for the scholarly output. Although back in the days, 25 years ago, when it was the only game in town, it was where we did put some stuff from the university's archives collection, as well as some of our other special collections. But 10 years ago, maybe a little more than 10 years ago, we launched a new digital repository called Digital Collections, which is a Fedora repository that originally developed with Hyrax, now it's Samvera interface, that is ostensibly where we put our digitized special collections work and a handful of born digital materials. And but that is a repository that has a significant amount of hands-on item level description that then became not really transferable to collections at scale. We had pulled in one born digital collection from our Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, which constituted a little under 2,000 total complex assets. And that took us such a significant amount of time as we realized we just don't have the bandwidth, the human resources to kind of do that work on a regular basis, that we needed to figure out some other way to be able to get our collections at scale into a digital preservation environment with a modicum of intellectual and administrative control, so that it's we know where our stuff is and what's up with it. So at the same time that this is kind of evolving, is the developers on our applications development and operations staff also wanted to begin to explore Fedora 6 a bit more, because eventually the idea is that digital collections, or DC platform, would be moved off of Fedora 4 and onto Fedora 6, as well as beginning to experiment doing all of these types of projects in Amazon Web Services, or AWS. For our initial users, University Archives, these collections at scale that we have been collecting born digital things since 2009, that had just been essentially sitting on a network server trying to figure out what we're going to do with it. We had a thing called the Dark Archive that was never a dark archive. We had little administrative control over what was there. Basically, a lot of abandoned digitization projects, some born digital acquisitions, some intentional digitization projects, but it was just on a secure FTP server with no real digital preservation activity happening. So we've been for years trying to get off of that device and move into a more robust digital preservation environment. So around the summer of 2021, we began contemplating what this thing might look like. And then over the next 2 years, we began building it, testing workflow, and amongst other things that it took time. And then the last aspect of that was writing the documentation, which at this stage is somewhere around 60 or 70 pages of documentation just on the ingest part of that. A year ago in January, we launched it. It is up and running, and we've had the University Archives as our initial first partner with this activity. And so at this stage, we are in the implementation phase, along with refining and new considerations, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So the other thing about Gray is that it allows for the curatorial deposit and retrieval, but no direct patron access. It's what I would call a dim archive, digital preservation, where that digital collection is a light archive where the patrons, the researchers can actually interact with the objects, they can download them, they can view them. Whereas this one, there is that no direct access by the public. It's also not a dark archive in the sense of, say, like something like the AP Trust, where you put the things in there and then everyone walks away from them other than the curatorial things that are going on with it. They're considered like the untouchable type of digital preservation. This is somewhere in between. This is much more like the stacks that we have at the facility we call the Book Depository, which is adjacent to our university archives, where you have row upon row upon row of stacks that go from the floor to ceiling with boxes of paper-based records there that are well described, whether from an MPLP, very minimal description, to some very detailed description. And so we have that intellectual control, and we also have that administrative control over knowing what box is on what shelf and how to get it. But it's not a place that the public is allowed to walk through like they are the stacks in the open library. So this is much more of a digital version of that, where our curators can go in and pull things back off that digital shelf, essentially, and bring it down and give it to researchers. In part, we have to be concerned sometimes about various legalities and privacy issues that we might have to redact records before giving them to the public to use. But we can also give it to them on external drives. We could probably put it to them through a team. We have developed secure virtual reading rooms where they can view this. So we have a lot of options to be able to provide access to it once the curator has brought it back, just like they bring back a box to the reading room and provide access to our patrons there. So this, provided a formalized path for that born digital content, not just from the University Archives, but from our other special collections as we begin to get it. We have some born digital content that is temporally or time-based restricted. Like we get congressional records from retiring Congress people or people that have been voted out of office. Their papers may come to us, but there's usually a 5-year gap between when we can provide access and when we may even be able to start to process them, after we actually get them. So we want to be able to put them in an environment where we know they're safe and secure, and we're doing those digital preservation activities. So that's another type of thing here. We also have in that thing that we referred to in the days of yore, the dark archive, where we have a lot of legacy digitization files that are the preservation files for things that are in the knowledge bank, things that might be in the Internet Archive for us through a Brittle Books project, and even some things that might be in our digital collections. That we may have to do some things there that putting based on certain rights restrictions, we may have to put them into this one. And that's that last bullet point there, is that there's digitized content we have a lot of audiovisual where we may not even be able to make the metadata or thumbnails available to it via our digital collections. We may just have to put it all into the Gray repository, where we have more of that restricted control over it. The other thing about this repository is that this is the first time I've worked with a repository where I can actually say that I actually am creating an AIP, an archival information package, and that's what we are storing. Whereas in like our digital collections or our knowledge bank, I have a harder time conceptualizing it because it's a much more diffuse set of circumstances in regards to what you would actually call the archival information package, where here we essentially are creating a bag and putting that bag into the repository, and that bag in and of itself is the archival information package. So these are some of the components of our existing system. You know, we're using things like VPN and remote desktop and such. Our key tool for doing manifestation of the records is using Droid, the digital record object identifier from folks at the National Archives UK, one of my favorite tools in the world. We are using a combination of ABBYY and Tesseract in a little app called Quick PDF OCR to actually OCR the dumb content we have, whether it be images or dumb PDFs, that we then use BitCurator's bulk extractor to identify if we have potential personally identifiable information that may need a flag around restriction. We're currently using Bagger to do the bagging of the content. We are storing it in an instance of Fedora on Amazon Web Services. Our finding aid system is Archivist Toolkit yet, although we are looking at replacement options because we really do need to replace that. And then administratively, we're storing administrative files in a Microsoft team, and we're using Microsoft Lists as a dashboard, external dashboard to Fedora to keep control of the content. That's a couple areas that I'm a little less impressed with what we're doing, but we're doing what we can do with the tools we have at hand, which is one of the things that I always try and make point out to folks that are getting started, is that you don't have to have all the big shiny bells and whistles. You can kind of do things with the tools you have at hand. And so I think this is a good example of what we're trying to do with that. So I know this is probably a little hard to read, but if you go to that go.osu.edu/gray-repo-wiki, you'll be able to view a larger version of this workflow. But essentially what we're doing is that we are accessioning the content. We're bringing it into a digital processing area where we're going to do that file manifestation, the characterization, creating initial checksums. We're doing that via Droid. And the Droid output is going to get stored in the bag with it as it goes into the digital preservation repository. But we're also keeping a copy of that those Droid reports in a thing that we call the accession ID ingest documentation folder. And that folder essentially then is going to get stored in that Teams instance I talked about. After doing Droid, we have to do the PII, or personally identifiable information identification. And with that, we're doing a combination of potentially having to do the OCR and then using bulk extractor. Once again, the output is going into that documentation folder, as well as it's going to get bagged with the content. Then we're actually using the Bagger tool to do that bagging. And once we have the bag, we ingest that bag into Fedora. We have a script that our developers created for us, that there's an S3 bucket that once we drop a zip file into that S3 bucket, which is the bag, it gets ingested in Fedora. It's going to do ingest, it's checksumming it, and then it's going to spit out a text file back to us into that ingest folder. That's a Fedora ID text that's going to have that long string of numbers that also looks like a checksum, except it's the Fedora ID that identifies where what that object is in the Fedora repository. Once again, we're going to be storing that locally, as well as that number then gets recorded in the finding aid tool. And essentially that brings us to the end of the ingest process. That accession documentation is pulled into Microsoft team. And then data from there is transcribed into that Microsoft list I was talking about that gives us information about bag size, the Fedora ID, the checksum, when it was ingested, who was ingested, notes field, things along those lines. So that's the existing workflow that we have currently and have been using for the past year. And this is, what it looks like when a curator goes in to retrieve something. Essentially, when we log into our Fedora instance, this is what we see. There is no search functionality. The only search functionality we have is the use of control find on that web page. And so you do control F to find. You copy in the Fedora ID that you've identified, say from the finding aid, and then that'll bring you to the asset. And then you click on it and you can download it. Now, in all transparency, is that we've had some issues with the size of the bag and being able to download it directly ourselves. And when that happens, I have to go to one of our developers and they do it on the back end. It's a work in progress that they're trying to up that throttling of that download capacity so that it is completely self-serve for the curators in the future. Now the really bad news in the full transparency is that this past summer, so we're about 6 months into the project, and our audiovisual preservation folks needed some information from some of a couple of digitized projects that they had conducted that we had gotten into the repository before they had a chance to transcribe that data. So when we went to download them, we found we had a corrupted set of bags. All told, it's 6 ingests that got corrupted. Sadly, they're all this audiovisual content. Sadly, 5 of them were digitized projects, which now are forever lost unless we redigitized. The other one was a Born Digital one that I happened to fortunately find the actual original files on a staging server that I'm able to re-ingest. But what we didn't know is what had gone wrong in the process as to whether something had happened to the bagging process or something happened in the ingest process. And this pointed out a glaring error that for all the work we had done, all the documentation I'd created, there was a key step or two that I missed in regards to quality control. So we should have been checking the bag to make sure that the contents in the bag, quantify up to the contents that existed on the drive initially. And then further is that we weren't comparing a checksum of the bag created before ingest and a checksum of the bag after it got into Fedora. So we've reworked the workflow to look at using Windows property to identify the number of files and the size of the files that are going to go into the bag, and then compare that to the OXM number that's created that gives you that same information from the bag itself. So that, even before we get ingest, we can say, yes, we created a bag that was whole of the contents. Then further is we're using ExactFile to generate an external checksum. But sadly, what Bagger's not doing is creating a checksum for the whole bag itself. So we're using another tool, ExactFile, to create that checksum so that once it is ingested, we can compare the 2 checksums and make sure that what got ingested was ingested whole. And since doing that, we've finally been able to decipher where the problem in our workflow was, and that was in the ingest process itself. Something was happening in that when the bag got to be about, it's bags that were over 80 gigabytes. And as it hit that 80 gigabyte threshold, for whatever reason, Fedora was shutting down on it, and it cut off the ingest at that point. And so it had only included whatever was included at that point in time. So, like I say, is what we've done now is we've gone back to add these quality control steps into the workflow, which I'm still reworking the documentation on that. Added that into the mix along with all the other tools that we're using there. We're also, there was a miscommunication or a non-communication between certain stakeholders in regards to when those things were ingested and summarily then disappearing from a shared server 30 days after ingest, because we just assumed, which was a bad thing to do, that they were there in the digital preservation repository, everything was fine and whole. Okay, we're getting them off the shared server to clear up that space. We did that. We deleted those files, so there was no going back. That what was in now the digital preservation repository is what we had. So, so sadly, those process, I mean, we could go back and redigitize if we have to. The content owners don't feel that's necessary, so there's at least that. So that's where we're at right now. Is I have to finish refining the workflow from a documentation point of view. But this is now what it looks like. Is we created this extra loop in there at from the bagging to the bag contents QA that becomes kind of a yes/no. Where what we're looking at then is that we have to compare the contents. If the contents don't match, then we have to rebag it. When the contents do match, we can go on to creating the checksum on the bag. And then from there, doing the ingest into Fedora. And then what we have to do is compare the checksum from ingest and the checksum in Fedora. If it's not, we have to go back and re-ingest or figure out what's going on. We may even have to deconstruct, maybe make the ingest multiple bags at a smaller size, make sure that it's going in a healthy way. But if not, then we're over and the workflow is done. Eventually this will be the workflow that you'll see on that wiki that we've created. But wait, there's more. So this summer when we were meeting with folks from Amazon Web Services, they talked about how they had implemented Archivematica on an S3 bucket for a university. And we're looking at other people that might be wanting to use this. And I've always been hesitant to use this because it's always felt like it would be a very heavy lift for our developer staff, which are already overstressed with so many other projects. I mean, we are lucky we have a developer staff, but there's only so many things we can do. So we felt, well, if we could stand this up by doing it this way, maybe this might be less of a load and less having to monitor the system from our developers' point of view. And could we test it out? So that's where we're at now. We're in the midst of beginning to test this as a potential workflow, and this would do a wholesale rewrite on what we're doing from a ingest workflow. This would replace all those tools that we've strung together manually ourselves and replace it with a potentially more seamless, potentially more user-friendly for the folks on our curatorial side to actually conduct the ingest. It might provide us with a integrated dashboard. So that's what we're in the midst of doing. We have the instance stood up for us at this point. This is just some extra examples of things that you can see how the microservices are being described there. The graphic to the right shows you kind of the components of what's there at the end of the process. Once again, it's essentially an AIP, which is what's nice about this is that it creates that. But Archivematica in and of itself is not the digital preservation system. It is a means to get something to a digital preservation system. So these are some of the potential components. And as you can see, the list of things under Archivematica are extensively larger than the tools that we were using. So this is one of the things that I'm going to be testing is how do these compare? Is there more functionality we're getting here, and how can we use that functionality to better manage the things once they're there? But at the same time, I've got some hesitancy too, because there is no natural connection between Archivematica and Fedora. So that if we take that bag and then push it into Fedora as a preservation environment, we lose the connection between the bag and the information that's in Archivematica. So that's another one of the considerations I have to be looking at and trying to discern what that is. We could use Archivematica and have the export go into a Amazon Web Services S3 bucket. We'd have all of that interconnectivity intact there. And then the question would be, is that S3 bucket good enough from a digital preservation point of view in regards to things like fixity and other things to allow us to say we have ourselves in a preservation environment? Some of the things that we'll be exploring. So I'm currently, that's why the Fedora is kind of like grayed down on this screen. But we still have the Amazon Web Services there. We still have Archivist Toolkit there until we have a replacement for Archivist Toolkit. Now, Archivematica, or I should say Artifactual, the creators of Archivematica, have a tool that is like an Archivist Toolkit, and it is one we are exploring. So that might be a benefit to us in the long run too, if we were to end up going in that direction where they're interconnected. Hard to say at this point. We're just kind of gotten beyond getting some basic understanding of what how the tool works, and done some real just kind of crash testing on it. And now I'm getting to the point of trying to put together the rigorous set of testing rules we're going to use to figure out what to do next with this. So that's where we are. And that looks to be about 20 minutes blow by blow going through that. This is my contact information, and As I'm apt to say at any type of presentation or training I do, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat with you about things digital preservation, some of the fun things in life. And with that, I'd open it up to Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. Everyone, please feel welcome to express your appreciation with Zoom clapping, Zoom applause. And Dan, you have some questions that came in via chat. There were some other chats that I want to quickly address, just some logistical things. There were questions, not for you, Dan, in particular, it's just a big picture for the series. There were some questions about the recordings. Pending permission from our speakers, we will be making the recordings available to DPC members first, and then after some time to all attendees. We have your email addresses since you registered for this event, so we can send that link out to you when it is available. But I appreciate your patience, and I apologize for any miscommunication in the chat. I know that there was some back and forth about that. But anyway, so Michael, would you be willing to help me read some of these questions to Dan in the chat? Or Lara, I think you were first. Would you like to speak your question?
Sure. There are a couple questions that I squeezed in there. So the first one is just, you may have mentioned this and I may not have quite caught it. I was just trying to understand if the description piece in your workflow, is that just completely automated based on like information that's extracted from Fedora, or is that like a manual process where someone adds it to the finding aid?
The Fedora ID.
Well, you had in your workflow a piece where description happens. And
Okay.
I guess maybe I'm not clear on what that consists of and how it happens. Down, yeah, where there's like it says fedora.txt and then it goes to find.
Finding, yeah. So the Fedora.txt, that's manually entered. We've created a field in Archivist Toolkit that will go into that manually is input into a field there. Now, once again, we go that Archivematica route. That might be more of a workflow that might get that into. If we go with that and we go with Atom, it might be an integrated workflow for something like that currently. But no, right now that's manual to do that.
So is it like it's just a high level kind of description?
So, well, right now, really what this is the well, currently for all of this, the finding aids exist already. These accessions were done some time ago. So right now we're working on backlog so that the curator would go into Archivist Toolkit, find that accession, and then in the Fedora ID field, they would copy and paste this Fedora ID number. So
Okay.
that when somebody is looking at the finding aid and they see that we have these digital records, they can ask the curator to get access to them for them.
Okay. And then the other question was, I was just wondering, I realized that you were kind of working on a backlog and trying to, get stuff through the workflow. But is there any point in the workflow where some kind of weeding or appraisal for born digital materials I'm talking about here might happen? For example, is it just coming straight off whatever transfer media and then like going through this process? Or is there some place in which appraisal and to eliminate things that are clearly out of scope for long-term preservation, like say system files that were automatically just included in whatever was transferred, or large numbers of duplicates, for example, might
Yes.
be deleted?
Right. So for the most part, currently with University Archives, they take them as is. That being said, the last thing you just mentioned there, large number of files, large number of duplicates, lots of nonsense. We had a hard drive that got accession that's got quadruplicates in it, nested 3 to 4 deep in regards to like zipped up files of the same content. That is one that I have set aside and I am working on that deduping. As we begin to expand this to more and beyond the backlog we have, although it might be helpful even in that current backlog of stuff, since we don't have a lot of intellectual control over what is in some of those files, is that the step after the Droid report, doing the Droid, is using the information generated by Droid to go through and do some of that, depending upon the nature of the collection's owner and what their status is on that. So that could be another thing that doesn't exist in the current workflow that could be added in there as an adjunct workflow before you go on to doing the next steps type of thing. And then once again, this is something that as I begin to test Archivematica, is that it has an appraisal function there. I have to learn how to utilize that more effectively to see if that might actually allow us to do some of these things.
Okay, thanks.
You know what? I'm sorry, and I just wanted to comment too on the Archivematica. The other thing that I need to find out if Archivematica can do is that whole PII identification thing, because we have to do that, or we will be having problems if we turn over things that have stuff in it that we weren't aware of. We could have been aware of it.
Great, thank you. So we have enough time for all our other presenters. I'm just going to ask you one more question, Dan, which is a very quick one. What tool do you use to compare the checkzones?
Actually, right now, because we're doing it on a one-by-one basis, we're just visually comparing them. So because it's not at a volume where I need to compare them en masse. When I did do that, when we went back and recalculated everything, compared everything that was in the repository at that point, where we had about 150 things in there at that point, I did use a spreadsheet to put them side by side and figure it out. But right now, because the content is going in kind of onesie twosies, it's pretty easy just to do that visual comparison once it's uploaded.